All right, let's talk about a story that is just incredibly dramatic. It's about how India completely transformed its economy, really, overnight. It was a massive, high-stakes gamble that ended up changing the lives of over 1 billion people.
So, how on earth does a country go from being on the absolute verge of bankruptcy to becoming an economic giant? Well, to get that, we have to rewind the clock to 1991. India was facing, without a doubt, its worst economic crisis since independence. The country was at a tipping point, a moment of real desperation that would force a total reinvention.
2 weeks. Just think about that for a second. That's it. In 1991, India had just enough foreign currency left to pay for about 2 weeks' worth of essential imports. We're talking things like oil to keep the country running. The treasury was practically empty. The country was literally staring into a financial abyss.
Now, a crisis of this magnitude, it doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was more like a slow-motion train wreck, the result of some really deep-rooted problems that have been building up for decades.
For years, the government's spending was just completely out of control. Think of it like a household budget. It was spending way more on things like social programs and defense than it was earning from taxes. That gap between what was coming in and what was going out, it grew into a massive chasm.
And a huge piece of this puzzle was the public sector. You see, a lot of the big, state-owned companies, the ones that were supposed to be the engines of India's growth, were just not making money. In fact, instead of adding to the government's income, many were so inefficient they were actually a huge financial drain on the country.
And as all this was happening, you know who felt it the most? Regular people. In their day-to-day lives. The prices for essential goods, food, fuel, everything, began to just skyrocket. This runaway inflation made the crisis even worse, squeezing family budgets all across the country.
So here's the bottom line. With its foreign reserves pretty much gone, India couldn't even pay the interest on the money it had borrowed from other countries. Nobody was willing to lend it another dime. The nation was on the absolute edge of defaulting, which for a country is a complete disaster.
So with its back completely against the wall and really no other options left, the Indian government had to go ask for help from the international community. But that help? Yeah, it wasn't going to be a freebie. It came with some very strict, very demanding strings attached.
So they go to the big guns, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and ask for a massive $7 billion emergency loan. The IMF and World Bank basically said, sure, we'll give you the money, but you have to completely overhaul your economy. You have to open up everything.
And out of this crisis, the new economic policy was born, and it's famously known by its acronym LPG. Now, not the gas, we're talking liberalization, privatization, and globalization. These 3 words became the new mantra, the blueprint for a whole new India.
All right, let's talk about the L in LPG, liberalization. This was the first and, honestly, the biggest change. For decades, the Indian economy had been tangled up in this incredibly complex web of government controls and red tape. It was time to just cut it all away.
In simple terms, liberalization was all about ending something called the license raj. Before 1991, if you were an entrepreneur, you needed government permission for pretty much everything. To start a business, to shut one down, even to decide how much of your product you were allowed to make. As you can imagine, it just choked innovation and growth for years. And the changes were just boom, boom, boom. Industrial licenses, gone for almost every industry. Private banks, foreign banks, come on in, the doors are open. Tax rates, slashed. The value of the Indian rupee, they deliberately lowered it to make Indian goods cheaper for the rest of the world to buy. And those huge taxes on imported goods, they came tumbling down.
Okay, so next up we have the P and the G, privatization and globalization. And let me tell you, this is where things got really controversial. Critics started accusing the government of basically selling off the nation's most valuable assets for cheap.
And that was the question at the heart of the whole debate. As the government started selling its shares in big public companies, people were asking, is this a smart move to make things more efficient, or is this just a desperate fire sale of the family silver to the highest bidder?
Now, the government's official goal was pretty clear. They said, look, we need to make these companies more modern, more disciplined financially. Bringing in private money and management will do that. It was also a key part of their strategy to attract a flood of investment from other countries.
And on that front, wow, did it work. Just look at these numbers. Foreign investment absolutely exploded. It went from about $100 million in 1990 to, get this, over $30 billion by 2018. The plan to attract foreign cash was, without a doubt, a staggering success.
But, and this is a huge but, this economic boom didn't lift everyone up. For some people, the consequences were absolutely devastating. For instance, reforms in the power sector led to higher electricity prices. In a small town called Sarasilla, this crippled the local weavers. Their wages were cut, many fell into a debt trap they could never escape, and tragically, dozens were driven to suicide.
So, let's fast forward to today. It's been over 3 decades. What's the verdict on the 1991 reforms? Well, it's complicated. It's really a mixed bag, a story of incredible growth, but also of really deep, persistent challenges.
I mean, the numbers on growth really speak for themselves. You can see India's overall GDP growth rate just took off, jumping from around 5.6% before the reforms to over 8%, and even higher in the years after. And the real star of the show here was the services sector. Things like IT, finance, that part of the economy just boomed.
But the critics raise some really serious points. They talk about jobless growth, meaning the economy got bigger, but it wasn't creating enough new jobs. The agriculture sector felt completely neglected, with farmers suddenly having to compete with cheap imports. And many local Indian industries struggled to survive against that same flood of foreign goods.
And this all gets to the core of the debate around globalization, right? On one hand, you have the view that it's a golden opportunity. It gives you access to global markets, new technology, and lets you become a major player on the world stage. On the other hand, some see it as a threat, a way for richer countries to capture the markets of developing ones, hurting local industries and people in the process. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
Which leaves us with this central, massive question. There is no doubt that India was pulled back from the brink of financial collapse and became a global economic force. But that progress came at a real, significant human cost. So, was the 1991 gamble, with all of its incredible triumphs and its heartbreaking tragedies, ultimately worth the price? Well, that remains the complicated legacy of these world-changing reforms.